Normally when we think of Tibetan Buddhism, we tend to think of monasteries, of red-robed monks, teachings on universal compassion. But we know comparatively less about the white-robed yogic lineage, which was tended to be practiced outside of monasteries by non-celibate male and female practitioners, and working in a way very directly with the embodied condition of the body, as opposed to the more renunciatory approach taken in the Buddhist sutras. And so the Tibetan yogas are based upon the Buddhist tantras, which emerged in India from the 6th century onward, and they have a different emphasis. And so what this book tries to do is to give a general introduction, a very visual introduction to these more esoteric, you could say occult practices of Tibetan Buddhism. Occult in the sense literally of the meaning of hidden knowledge or secret knowledge. And these practices were often considered to be secret, and they were often given only in an initiatic context between a teacher and a student, who would then go off and practice them. So this book is a departure from that tradition, and that was actually a request by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who literally said the time of secrecy is over, and that these practices should be fully explained rather than sort of halfway explained and halfway concealed. He said that will just lead to greater confusion. And so this book is an attempt to kind of reveal this aspect of the what so-called completion stages of the Tibetan Buddhist practices, which are based upon the physical body, working with the body, the breath, and consciousness in a very dynamic way, as opposed to often a more just introspective and contemplative way. So in that sense, the book is structured around what are so-called the 6 yogas, which are the kind of hallmark of the inner Tantric Buddhist tradition in Tibetan Buddhism. And these are, of course, based upon the Tibetan Buddhist meditative practices, which are often involve active imagination through creative visualization. But the 6 yogas work much more with the energy body, the subtle body. And it's about activating, in a certain sense, the innate human capacities that that are there, but tend not to be, they're dormant in the sense that they are not something that we actively engage with. But the beauty of the 6 yogas, which is in a sense the subject matter of the book, Tibetan Yoga, is that these are practices that can be applied at any time, in any stage of life. And the first of the so-called 6 yogas is referred to often as the illusory body, the magical body, the gyulu in Tibetan. And this is a recognition that all the practices are done with a recognition, not that the body is illusory, that's a literal translation, but it's really the energy body, if we want to see it that way. So the fact that we tend to identify with the material aspects of our body is really to overlook the fact that all matter is energy. And so all of the 6 yogas work with the body as a not just subtle energy, but the very energetic substratum of all physical reality. So this is the foundation for all of the 6 yogas, and the first of the foundation, as it's referred to, is Tumo, which is, for those of you familiar with it, the yoga of inner fire. And this is a direct translation of the original Sanskrit word Chandali, which was the goddess of fear, literally means fierce, the fierce feminine. And this was directly translated from Chandali in Sanskrit to Tumo in Tibetan. But we tend to think of it in English as inner fire or inner heat. And this is a very dynamic way of, if we compare it, let's say, to the modern mindfulness movement, which was essentially derived from contemplative monastic practices that were based upon essentially a passive observation of the breath, of its coming and its going, in order to enter into meditative states. This is a very working dynamically with the breath in order to enter into very profound altered states of consciousness through held breath and expansion of the breath rather than just passive observation. So in the practices of inner fire, which is the foundation, it's a gathering of energy in the pelvic cradle, working with the central channel of the body, which is the medium in which all of these 6 yogas take place. And we see this across different traditions, of course. It's not something unique to Tibetan Buddhism, but Tibetan Buddhism has been very sophisticated in its development of these practices. The general way in which these practices are done with the tumo, because it is the foundation, so it's starting at the foundation of the body, as I said, in the pelvic cradle, if you will, and working with what we would now think of as this sort of gut-brain axis. And so this is working with a kind of harmonization and synchronization of different centers in the body that we think of as chakras, and of course in the esoteric Eastern traditions. And this leads to the yoga of inner fire, leads to what's called the yoga of clear light, the osel. And this is really this innate nature of human embodiment as light, as luminosity. And so these are dynamic practices like the yoga of inner fire for entering into that state of what's often described as bliss, clarity, and emptiness. And so the book goes into quite a lot of detail as to different kinds of methods, the physical practices that can be done in order to enter into that luminous continuum, which is held to be the transpersonal reality, in which we tend to sort of narrow ourselves down in our own minds, literally, thinking of ourselves as just this physical body. But in fact, the Tibetan Buddhist view, as it is true of all other esoteric traditions as well, is that we are kind of co-continuous with the cosmos. And we see that a lot in the Tibetan Buddhist mandala art, for example. And this book is very richly illustrated, so in a certain sense it also goes into a deep exploration of Tantric Buddhist art to look at how this art is an expression of different states of consciousness. So in that articulation of the sort of journey, as it were, through the subtle energy system of the body, starting with the yoga of inner fire at the base of the body, the yogas of luminosity or clear light are often associated with the heart chakra. And because it's a non-celibate lineage originally, there is also one of the 6 yogas is described as Consort Practice, and obviously this is a mutually consensual way in which the inner fire can be enhanced, and it's sort of a auxiliary practice, but the book goes into quite a bit of detail to try to clarify some of the misconceptions of Tantra generally in the Western world, which often tends to be seen as a form of sacred sexuality, but is obviously much more than that as well. So in that sense, when we look at what Tantra means, we look at the early Buddhist sutras, for example, which sutra, which were the early scriptures based on the Buddha's early teachings, has the same etymological root as the word suture in English. So it was literally a thread, a kind of continuity that explained our human existential condition. And the Tantras, which developed from the 6th century, were extensions of the Buddhist sutras. And the word Tantra literally means to expand and to extend and to weave. So if we look at what the Buddhist Tantras as textual sources of these yogas is really all about, it's about extending the relevance of the thread, as it were, of early Buddhism into the grand tapestry of the Tantric Buddhist tradition. So when it comes to these 6 yogas, we then see how we engage all aspects of the human condition in order to access different aspects of our nature that are often hidden from ourselves just by virtue of inattention. So as we move through the inner fire into the clear light of the heart center, we then move into the dream yogas, which are practiced, of course, initially during states of lucid sleep. And so the book goes into quite a bit of detail. There's actually quite a lot of images and paintings that haven't really been published before that show about the inner technology of using subtle vibration, sound, mantra to bring about a state of conscious awareness during rapid eye movement sleep, the dreams, while sleeping, so that we can begin to alter the narratives of what are often experienced as passively as events that we don't have kind of conscious agency within. So the whole idea of dream yoga is, while we're sleeping in these subconscious states, to wake up, as it were, and to then be able to master the subconscious, if you will, in order to be able to alter outcome. And then that's applied ultimately within the waking state of consciousness, and we begin to realize that the continuity of mind and our own and our perceptual reality, so that we can begin to work creatively and constructively with the outer world as well, while awake, rather than just during sleeping states. This moves forward into, as we move literally up through the subtle energy system of the body, into the fifth of the six yogas, which is POA, or the ejection of consciousness, or transference of consciousness at the time of death, a separation of consciousness from the physical body. And it's a very dynamic practice. It's interestingly, it's the most openly taught of all of the so-called six yogas, which, as I mentioned, are generally held to be kind of a secret teachings. But the POA tradition is often given taught very widely to large congregations. And part of the reason is that it's kind of, if you will, a spiritual insurance policy, and something that when people have received those teachings, they can apply it over just a 5-day period, and you get very tangible signs. So, for example, in the fontanelle at the top of the head, a small aperture often appears, and a small amount of pus or blood appears at the top of the head, and this represents this opening of the subtle energy channel at the core of the body. So it's something that can be done, and in a very short time manifest very concrete results. And the idea of this is that at the time of death, one basically uses this technique, which is developed through breath control, mantra, and focused attention, in order to kind of transcend through some of the kind of hypnagogic and hallucinatory experiences that tend to be associated with the near-death states, in order to just move directly into a transcendent dimension. And then the sixth of the yogas is Bardo Yoga. That may be a word that a lot of you are familiar with. It's often the Bardo Chodel is a very seminal 15th century Tibetan Buddhist text. It was translated in 1927 as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but that was more of a kind of poetic reference to the Egyptian Book of the Dead. But the text does refer literally to methods by which someone who is in the state of dying can move through a kind of hallucinatory, hypnagogic state for sort of safe passage, if you will, through this kind of liminal state of being that occurs after death. And so there's a lot of imagery, again, in the book from Tibetan wall paintings and other sources that go into accounts of the after-death post-mortem experience, and how this relates to the kind of current research that's being done now with after-death experiences, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, etc. So in all of these cases, in all the chapters, there's quite a bit of reference to what contemporary neuroscience, for example, is able to tell us about, where we see, in a way, imaging of what happens within the brain and other parts of the body as a result of these kinds of dynamic practices, which tend, interestingly, to produce very dramatic results in terms of neuroplasticity that go beyond what, for example, the more quietistic mindfulness practices produce. And this, I think, is a very interesting and engaging aspect of these practices. That and there's actually been limitations in how they could be researched before within the scientific community because they involve breath holdings and things like that that literally, with health and safety concerns, are sometimes limited in terms of what could be done in scanners, for example. But some of those limitations are now lifted, and they're finding very interesting results as a result of working more dynamically with the breath and with the body. And I didn't mention that at the very foundations of all of this, as we've sort of literally moved up through the body, through the central channel and out into the cosmos, as it were, at the end, where this separation of the mind and body from the continuum of all life, in a way, is transcended. But there's the very the physical yogic practices, working with the physical body in a way that's very much more familiar to us from how yoga is practiced today, working dynamically with asanas in yoga classes, for example. There's a very dynamic way in which these practices are done in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition called trukor, which literally translates as magical movements. And in some ways they're more akin to certain forms of qigong, but a lot of them also have very direct reference to the hatha yoga tradition. And they also have very dynamic moves associated with them, such as these great leaps, and where you land on the base of your spine in order to bring about an opening of the central core of the body. So there are a lot of images, for example, in the book, photographs of Tibetan and Bhutanese yogis and yoginis practicing these kinds of methods that had not been published before because, as I mentioned, these have been considered to be secret and therefore have not been shown. But there's a change, as I said, that has been initiated by persons like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who has felt that these represent a kind of a hidden core of Tibetan Buddhism that, unless they're revealed, will just die out. So that's partly what the book is about, is to try to bring about increased interest, increased research in these very dynamic practices. And these physical practices, literally, of the Tibetan physical yogas, which are literally called trukor. They're often known today, for example, there are classes in London taught by people like John Renshaw and others called Yantra Yoga. So this is working with the body as a yantra, as a device for moving out of our kind of common self-perceptions into a much more dynamic and engaged way of relating to our energetic substratum and therefore to all of life. So the book, after going through the 6 yogas, also deals with several other sort of say follow-on yogic practices. There's a very esoteric, and so far not much has been written about it, of the use of psychotropic substances within the Buddhist Tantric tradition. And this is all based upon textual sources from the 6th century onward. So one whole chapter, which is called Potent Solutions, explores the way in which psychoactive substances were used within the contemplative and meditative context in order to bring about an expanded states of awareness that would, of course, develop the foundational values of the Tantric Buddhist tradition of wisdom and compassion. So obviously not for recreational use, but in order to be able to access these deeper states of consciousness. And so I think this offers, particularly in the kind of research that's going on today and the revelation of certain substances that have been vilified in the past but are now being discovered as having great healing potential, this book is sort of looking at this sort of uncovering, if you will, an aspect of the Tibetan Buddhist practice and Tantric Buddhist practice that had been kept relatively hidden until now. A further chapter at the end of the book called Primal Radiance is where does all this lead to? And so these 6 yogas are not just practices in order to develop greater range of for entertaining ourselves while we're dreaming, sleeping, dying, basically at all stages of life in which they can be practiced. But they refer to ultimately the experience, if in the original text of the 6 yogas, the ultimate experience is what's called sahajananda, which is in Sanskrit the spontaneous bliss that arises, in which when you enter into this energetic substratum of our own embodiment, it's a blissful state. It's separated. It's not, therefore, it's not conditioned by dukkha. It's sukha, which means bliss, as opposed to dukkha, which is suffering, which is the fundamental sort of truth that was pointed out by the Buddha, that life is often conditioned by this state of dissatisfaction or unsatisfactoriness. So the whole idea that these practices of working dynamically with the body, breath, and mind is to bring us into a state of bliss and clarity, with compassion and altruistic intent as its focus. And so the book goes, and then this concept of Sahajananda in Tibetan is understood as Maha Mudra, and also known as Dzogchen, the great perfection. And these are practices that ultimately also involve physical practices, but they, in a way, take and distill the essence of the six yogas, and they put them into a very, very dynamic way in which they can all be kind of engaged directly without going through some of the complexities, for example, of the magical movements of the Trulkor, but direct access, as it were, to our fundamental human capacity and our nature. So in the end, this is really what the whole book of Tibetan Yoga is about, a visual, sort of anthropological, if you will, overview of these esoteric aspects of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition that has, because of various social and institutional reasons, been kept relatively hidden. And so this is a way of introducing practices that were literally not originally developed for monks. They were developed for people living outside of that kind of context, and therefore have a great relevance in our everyday lives today. So the book is literally called Tibetan Yoga Principles and Practices. So it's an overview of the whole, you could say, the ideology of these practices. It does go into some depth about how the practices are carried out, but it's not a method and techniques. It's not like that. There may be a follow-up on that, but because of the emphasis in these practices as being something that has been always transmitted between a master and a disciple, at least in this initial book, I've kept it as something that talks more about literally principles and practices, but not a how-to book.
I wouldn't be able to interpret the book itself.
Well, it did. No, I mean, it still. But the point is, it explains what these practices are about. So before one would actually even want to begin engaging them, one has to sort of understand what they're for. So that's really what this book is about: is to show the whole purpose of these practices, and that's what it tries to get at. Yeah. Great question, because I didn't answer that specifically. I did start out the talk by talking about how, when we think of Tibetan Buddhism, we tend to think of monasteries and red-robed monks, and kind of teachings on compassion, etc., but we know relatively little about the white-robed tradition, which is associated with, as you referred to it, the Mahasiddhas, the accomplished yogic masters. And these were male and female figures that lived mostly from the 8th to the 11th, 12th century. And these are the ones in which these yogic practices were, for the most part, transmitted through tantras that were often referred to as the yogini tantras, or the mother tantras. And this is, I think, the beauty of what makes so many of these practices relevant today, is that Mahasiddhas were living outside of any kind of institutional context. So I think they're figures that we can relate to much more easily today than we can to a celibate monastic type of lifestyle. So they were again passed on from Mahasiddhas directly to their students. For example, probably the most classic and well-known example is the Mahasiddha Tilopa, who taught to Naropa, because often these 6 yogas are referred to as the 6 yogas of Naropa, even though there were actually different lineages, and particularly the 6 yogas of Niguma, who was a female contemporary of Naropa. So they were passed on one-to-one or in small groups, and often to other people living outside of any kind of institutional monastic context. So there wasn't a limitation. These were practices that could be integrated into one's daily life. In a very brief way, they have generally the same structure, but in the Six Yogas of Sukhasiddhi and Niguma, they tend to emphasize more the clear light and the sort of subtle, almost, and I hesitate to use the word, but sort of astral states, as opposed to the kind of core. I mean, they also have Tummo as a foundation, but they tend to emphasize more the clear light experiences. And the Six Yogas of Niguma are very profound, and they were literally, she was a contemporary of Naropa. And the training courses in London, there is a friend, John Renshaw, who teaches Yantra Yoga in London, and Yantra Yoga is a form of the Chulkor, you could say, of the magical movements that are fundamental and foundational to all of the Six Yogas. And this is a form of the Chulkor that was transmitted by Chögyal Namkhay Norbo Rinpoche, who just recently passed away. And so they are a very profound way of working with the subtle energy system of the body. So you could Google that, easily to be found. Certainly, it's a good way of entering into a deeper appreciation for the other yogas that emerge out of that kind of physical training. Generally has sort of two different ways in which it's, let's say, to distinguish it from lucid dreaming, which of course is widely taught now. So lucid dreaming referring to sort of waking up within the dream state, and then what one does with that awareness, that lucidity, at the same time the dream narrative is often continues. It's not as if it just goes away just because you wake up in the dream. Doesn't mean you actually wake up, but it does mean that you have agency within the dream state, and therefore you can begin to sort of change the narrative of the dream. If you're walking left, you can decide you're going to walk right, or if there's a wall in front of you, you can decide you're going to walk through it rather than around it. So Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, for example, when he tried to give a very synoptic explanation of dream yoga, he said the great purpose of dream yoga is that there's more possibilities in dreams than we have in our usual waking life. In other words, we can fly, we can walk through walls, we can do many things we can't do in real life. And so therefore to develop this kind of agency within the sleeping state is something that then carries over into our waking reality. And the idea then becomes that we become fluid and conscious within these normally unconscious states. This carries over into our consciousness in our waking state, and we begin to realize that there's a kind of fluidity, and that things that we take to be just sort of existentially real and unalterable begin to feel a little bit more mutable. And so this is the idea of dream yoga, is to carry it over into the waking state. And the truism that to view life as a dream isn't just to sort of not take it seriously, or but really to actually realize that just like a dream, we have agency and possibilities that are often things we don't recognize or wake up to. Yes, no, these are very much living traditions, and in Tibet they are still practiced, but I'd say even more in Bhutan. So Bhutan is just south of Tibet. It's sort of the last remaining, as it were, Tibetan Buddhist, or let's say Himalayan Buddhist kingdoms, and there's a very, very active transmission of these six yogas and the Chulkor, the physical practices there as well. And more and more of these practices are becoming open, and people are able to go to Bhutan, for example, to study with living masters. And the teachings there are much more accessible than they are in Tibet, because it's not an occupied country. And so for people to practice these things in Tibet now, you have to do it. It has to be much more hidden. And certainly for Westerners to go to Tibet and have access to the teachings is very, very difficult, if not impossible. So Bhutan, and to some degree Nepal, is a place where these practices can be studied.
Is it a very minute number of people?
Not really. So in Bhutan it's very interesting. So there is a very strong monastic system, but there's also a deep recognition that these are the so-called completion stage practices, and so even people who have either been in a monastic system will then graduate, as it were, and do intensive retreats, often 3 years, 3 months, 3 days, to practice these, or it can also be people who have never been outside of, or practitioners outside of a monastic context can also be initiated into these practices and carry them into their daily lives. So this is makes it a very rich living transmission of these practices in Bhutan that were traditionally held to be hidden. But as you'll see if you look through the book later, and there's pictures of, for example, a practitioner of the Trulkor system of the physical yogas connected to the Six Yogas of Naropa, who's shown doing one of these great leaps in the air and going into full lotus and landing back on the mat with this held kumbhaka, the vase breath, for example. And these were things that until a few years ago were completely, never revealed and shown, and now they're being shown quite openly. He's a great teacher, and he teaches a form of the Trulkor that is, I think, very much adapted in a way to our contemporary needs. Some of the forms of the Trulkor, for example, are very difficult and demanding, and in a way can easily injure oneself. So I think he's a very, very good teacher, and would definitely be a good way to begin. For teaching, for the other forms of the Six Yogas, I mean, my website right now is down, but it's something to look at because I will be starting and collaborating with other friends and with a great teacher in Bhutan, Tuku Tenzing Rabgye, who has offered to be a great master of the Six Yoga tradition. So we'll be starting from next year in April a series of introductions to the Six Yogas, and he'll be starting with the Poa.
In London?
Sorry, no, this will actually be in Bhutan. But we may get him over here as well. But the first one is to be in Bhutan. So just something that one can...
What is your website?
It's just ianbaker.com. But it's under reconstruction, so give it a few days. So Dzogchen, which is a term that many people are aware of, it translates directly, it's the last chapter of the Tibetan Yoga book. And the chapter on Dzogchen is in the book called Primal Radiance. And this refers to yoga in its ultimate sense as it's understood in the Tibetan tradition. So Tibetan translate yoga as Naljur. Naljur means the natural state. And so this natural state is basically the state that is an awakened state of being that is always present, and yet we tend to be somehow unaware of because we are caught up in this kind of view of ourselves as a personality as opposed to a great field of interconnectivity and energy. So Dzogchen is the subject of the longest chapter in this book because it is the culmination, and the purpose of all of these six yogas is to, in a way, bring us into this natural state, which is the ultimate state of yoga as union with our own natural mind, as it's literally called in the tradition. And I mentioned also how this is the word Dzogchen is synonymous often with the word Maha Mudra, or Shakchen in Tibetan, which is the outcome of all of the six yogas. And this is literally, as it's described in the earliest of the texts associated with the six yogas, refers to the state of Sahajananda. So Sahaja, which is the natural, spontaneous state of bliss. And so Dzogchen, which we refer to as the natural condition of the mind and its awakened state of Rigpa, in other words, a state of awareness that is free of the kind of discursive preoccupations that we often tend to think of when we think of our own state of consciousness. It's a awakened state, and the states of the vibrant states that are brought about by the six yogas are ways of inducing and bringing us into a direct presence and awareness of that naturally awakened state, which is actually our own natural state of being. So all of the book Tibetan Yoga in a way is finally just pointing out different methods for arriving at that state of what's called in Tibetan Rigpa, which is this kind of primordial awareness, which is our own natural condition. So the Maha Mudra, which is often by many great teachers held to be synonymous with Dzogchen, and the Maha Mudra path uses the six yogas as skillful means in order to enter into the state of Maha Mudra. So Maha Mudra meaning the great, it's sort of literally the great coalescence, the great seal, the different ways in which it can be translated. But this is the Maha Mudra path in which the 6 yogas have traditionally been taught. And so in the tradition of Dzogchen, they use the 6 yogas as a kind of foundation for Dzogchen. But interestingly, within you could say the preliminary practices of Dzogchen, they take some of these methods, like the Trulkor, and they adapt them into a more distilled and radical ways in which, for example, the Trulkor, rather than being a very set stage of 25 movements or 108 movements, is done very dynamically and sometimes very spontaneously, but having the same effect. So in Dzogchen and has this sort of element where you've taken some of the kind of sequenced aspects of the Maha Mudra path and practice it very, in a way, radically and dynamically, trying to extract the essence, as it were, out of the more systematized Buddhist tantras. Well, when we really talk about what's called essence Maha Mudra, as opposed to, which is really almost synonymous, you could say, with Dzogchen, we're not really talking about ritual anymore. We're talking about working with the energy body. And sort of the ritual practices, we tend to think, generally Tibetan or Tantric Buddhism is sort of divided into what they call creation or development phase, and then the completion phase. And so the ritual practices tend to be associated with creative imagination, active imagination in a Jungian terms, where you work with the mind in order to change the way we tend to view reality. And then the completion stages are work with the 6 yogas and other ways in which we work, in a sense, beyond the mind, directly with the energy body. I was 19, I traveled to Nepal. It was a long time ago. And I met a great master of the tradition when I was 19 and became a teacher. He only passed away a couple of years ago at the age of 102. And it led me, and he was a great master of he was married, he was not a monastic, but a yogi. And so I found this fascinating. He was also spent most of the year high up in the mountains. And so my interest in all of this Tantric Buddhist tradition was not the red-robed monastic tradition. It was the white-robed yogic tradition. And when I asked him, he said if I was serious, he sent me off to a cave alone for a month. And so this sort of developed in a kind of an apprenticeship that for me was just foundational to my life. And so this book, in a certain sense, is about decades of not really so much research, but immersion within a living tradition.
What is it about cave?
It's about going back to the source. I guess we grew up in caves as a species, so we kind of go back to. And as we know, it's closer to Buddha's own path. Buddha actually left his monastery, left his palace to go off into the forests and meditate, where you get natural shelter in caves. And in a way, we're going back to that kind of original tradition of kind of connectedness to nature. Whereas we know with a lot of the institutional monastic forms of Buddhism now, it's like building palaces again. So there was one great Tibetan Lama who said, Buddha left his palace to go into the forest to reach enlightenment, but now these lamas are cutting down the forest to build palaces to reach enlightenment. How does that work? So in a certain sense, the yoga tradition sort of bypasses all of that. In my personal estimation, that was really, for me, what made this a living path for me, was the fact that I wasn't just, that I went off and followed his advice and went off into the mountains. And I think there was something very powerful about just being completely on one's own in a remote Himalayan cave, which I used to do every year for a while. So that was, for me, it was a very important part of the training. Question. Yeah, when this journey for me sort of began in the 1970s, and somehow there seemed to be a lot more time. So if I understood your question right, was, in our contemporary world, does it work that way? I don't think it would for me, just because somehow life has become so busy, so full, and there was this incredible sense back then. It was long before iPhones, it was long before email, and there was a sense where you could just disappear into the Himalayas for months at a time, and the rest of the world could disappear.
What do your parents think of you going to the cave? Sorry.
They wish they could have come.